All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the part four, the final part of our cold climate webinar series. Today, we have Megan Luke with us, and it looks like a few more people are joining. So I'm going to wait maybe a couple seconds here, and then we'll get started. I'll share my screen. All right. It looks like we got a couple people joining. Cool. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'll just introduce Megan here quick, and then she will go ahead and take it over. Just a quick reminder to throw any questions into the Q&A chat, and that's the one with the little question mark at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'm so happy to have Megan with us today to talk about achieving maximum sprayer effectiveness. And Megan is from Penn State University Extension and has a lot of great knowledge to share. So like I was just saying, this is the fourth and final part of our cold climate fruit webinar series. You can scan this QR code or go to fruit.wisc.edu/webinars/apples to view past recordings. And eventually this one recording will also be up on that page. So I'll leave it up on the screen for a minute here.
You guys must have
All
some
right.
nice weather. You have
Yeah.
not too many in-person participants, so I'm guessing everyone's
Yeah.
out spraying today.
It is really nice out today. Yeah, and we're at Green Tip in southern Wisconsin, so definitely getting out
Critical
there.
times. Yeah.
Indeed. So, yes, Megan is from Penn State University Extension. She's the viticulture and tree fruit extension educator, and her major focus is on integrated pest management. So again, just please use the Q&A chat to ask questions. That just helps us keep track of things. Megan may ask you to throw some responses in the chat, as the regular chat as well. So feel free to do that. I will send a follow-up email next week with any responses to unanswered questions, some links to further resources, as well as the webinar recording, which will just be a YouTube link. I will also be sending out a webinar series evaluation link next week with that follow-up email, as well as for any registrants or participants in previous webinars in the series. You'll be able, in that evaluation link, you'll be able to select the webinars you attended and offer input. Most of these questions will be multiple choice. A couple might be short answer, but please, if you're able, fill out that evaluation as it helps us really plan for future webinars and lets us know what you're interested in. So with that, again, I just want to thank you all for joining, and I will go ahead and pass it off to Megan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. If folks don't mind, while I'm getting my screen loaded up, if you want to drop in the chat what your primary commodity is so I can kind of tailor the experience today, that'd be great. It helps me to just kind of keep an eye on what folks are most interested in so I can tailor my talk to your needs. So my talk today is on sprayer optimization, but really what that comes down to is there's a lot of pieces to our spray program that allow us to have the best performance of the products that we're using every time that we apply them. And one of the big confounding factors that we have, of course, in the Midwest and the Northeastern region where I work, is really our weather patterns. We've been seeing some pretty crazy weather patterns in the last few years that can really lead to some challenges when it comes to spray optimization. So I'm going to go over just a few different methods that we have for optimizing our spray program and some pieces that, while we all hear about them all the time, I really want to bring home some of the tasks we can put into our workflow to really improve and give our products the best chance of good performance in the field. So as I was introduced, my name is Megan Luke. I'm really focused on IPM, and I do a lot of work with sprayer technology in the Lake Erie Grape Belt. I'm a member of the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program team, which is a collaboration between Cornell and Penn State. And I'm part of the Pennsylvania statewide sprayer calibration program. So we offer on-site extension-led sprayer calibration for air blast and boom sprayers every year to help folks get their program dialed in. So some of my what I talk about today will come from my experiences with that program and just some things that I really have seen, boots on the ground in the field that folks can struggle with at times. So you will see that some of these slides are kind of geared toward the grape industry. So I do recycle some of my presentations, but this all applies to a much broader audience. And so I will be, gearing things towards apple production and tree fruit where I have the opportunity. So some of the most common issues that cause issues within our spray program are going to be, of course, our application timing. That's one of those really weather-specific issues, right? And why I'm assuming we have a pretty low participation in person today is because when you have a nice day, you have to get out there and you have to put the application on. So just talking a little bit about that and how to make sure that we're optimizing the timing of our applications. One of the challenges that we have are, of course, frequent infection periods when we have a very wet spring, especially around bloom, that can lead to a lot of challenges. And then we want to be paying attention to where our material is going, because runoff doesn't just impact the surrounding environment. It also impacts your spray program, because it means that the material that you applied to the plants is going someplace else and it's not working in the place that you needed it to work. Finally, we'll talk about water quality and then a little bit about sprayer calibration and some of the benefits to that practice. So this is just kind of a bigger breakdown of some of those concerns and some of the ways that these issues can cause breakdown in our spray program. So I'm not going to linger too much here because we're going to just go ahead and dive right in. But of course, application timing is going to be one of the first things, and in some cases, the most important piece to your spray optimization. I know Josie said that you had already had a presentation about NUA, so I'm just going to revisit that just really briefly. Knowing when you have an infection period and making sure that you have your product on the plant before the infection period occurs is absolutely critical to the optimization of your spray program. There are very, very few products that provide any sort of burn back for existing infections, of course. So we want to make sure that we have the materials on prophylactically to cover the plants and protect them from incoming insects or diseases during their infectious periods. So NUA is one of the best programs that we have in order to determine for your site the best time in order to apply your pesticides. So I know I work a lot with grapes, but in apples, we have everything from insect models to disease models that can give us at least a few days warning when there is an infection period coming. So accessing the NUA Cornell website and then finding the weather station closest to your location and selecting the models that are relevant to your operation is a really great way to make sure that you're optimizing your spray program. Now, that's all well and good. When we have frequent infection periods, though, we can run into issues with following the pesticide label and not applying your next application too soon. And you can run into issues with if rain comes in unexpectedly. So some things to pay attention to when you do have frequent infection periods. Check to see if the label has any recommendations for rain. There are some products that require a certain amount of time to pass before the rain begins in order for the product to be rain fast. So make sure that you're always checking the label for those dry down requirements so that you can get the product on and have it working before adverse weather. Make sure that you're rotating your mode of action, especially if you're having to apply more frequently to prevent some disease. Make sure that you are rotating your mode of action so that you're not contributing to disease resistance to those products. Pay close attention on your label to your maximum application rate so you don't exceed those. Of course, look for rain-fast products or see if there's a recommended adjuvant that you can add. And of course, be prepared to pivot as well. So a lot of this is all common sense, of course, but sometimes when you know you have adverse weather or you've had these really frequent rains, disease heavy periods, it can be good just to kind of go back to basics and review some of these things so that you can, regain a modicum of control with some of these situations. So I know there was also a presentation with Carrie Peter, who's our pathologist down at the Fruit Research Extension Center in Pennsylvania. And so these slides she's been kind enough to share with me, but I really like what they demonstrate. So in 2025, the Fruit Research Center for Penn State had one of the few crops of Honeycrisp that were actually clean. And for that to occur, they were able to get sprays on before the critical before the infection period. And so these were the critical sprays that allowed the apples to stay clean. So as you can see, they were able to get a spray on within a few days of each of these infection periods, and that led to a clean crop. And in some cases, it was put on directly after the infection period, but that provided coverage going into the next one. So it's just nice to kind of see it all laid out here, how getting in during those brief windows when they were able to spray was able to protect the crop throughout the season. Okay, so I mentioned preventing runoff, and there's a lot of reasons to prevent runoff, and it is important to optimize our programs because if you apply a pesticide heavily enough, if you're using enough product that it's dripping off the plants, you're actually losing active ingredient and you're not going to have as much protection as you would like to have. In addition to that, and this is kind of a little plug that I put into a lot of my presentations, the EPA has been changing a lot of our pesticide label requirements, and we are going to be beholden to much more stringent guidelines regarding our runoff and our drift. So I know, especially with our grape growers, drift has been more of something that happens to you rather than something you cause. But at the same time, when we're using air blast sprayers and frequent pesticide applications, it's important to make sure that we are aware of these new label requirements and that we're mitigating properly. So for our mitigation of drift and runoff, you want to make sure that you're reading your pesticide label and you're completing the mitigation calculator if it's required by that pesticide. Check for bulletins on the Bulletins Live 2 website, have a documentation of your IPM plan, and keep an eye on the weather. So with the mitigation menu on these pesticide labels, this is going to be any new product that has these requirements. So one of the products that I know is coming down the pipeline right now, it's a new registration. So pesticides that are being reviewed as part of the normal 15-year cycle under which pesticides are reviewed for safety. There is those products are going to be the first ones to have these new label requirements and any new registrations. So isocycloserum is a new mode of action insecticide that's registered for use in a lot of tree fruit and vegetables. And that product is going to have these new requirements on the label. So this might be one of the first ones that you see. If there is label language, let me see here. I think I have it on this slide where it says mandatory spray drift management. There's going to be information on the label about special considerations you have to do in order to legally use that pesticide. So that could include using one of these online calculators under their mitigation menu. If you go to the EPA's website under the mitigation menu, first you have to determine whether or not you're exempt from having to do that. And then you use the runoff and the drift calculator to see if there are specific buffer zone requirements that you are beholden to, or if you need to have special strategies in place to use the product. So again, this is just a little side digression from my talk on sprayer optimization. But this is something that's really important to pay attention to. And you, of course, do want to make sure that you're not having your product run off the plant, run off into another location where it could cause damage to endangered species or the critical habitat. So you want to check for this label language, utilize the tools that are there and the calculators, and then make sure that you're in compliance with the pesticide label. Some of these actually have that point system. So they may say that they require 3 points. There are forms or an app where you can fill out your details about your farm and your operation and your spray style, your equipment and things like that in order to determine if you have enough points to use the product. Most folks, just based on the use of the tool with folks that I work with, do have a base number of points to get them to a point where they can use most pesticides without having to make any major changes to their operation. But it is important to fill this stuff out and to make sure that you are in compliance. These are products that are registered for use in grapes specifically, but they're also products commonly used in tree fruit. So if you're using any of these active ingredients, these are some of the products that were due for review in 2025. So they'll be some of the first ones that we start seeing that new label language on. So just keep an eye. If you're using any of these products, keep an eye on your label and make sure that you're following all the recommendations and requirements for those specific products. Okay, now we can get out of regulatory land. I really like to take a few minutes just to make folks aware of that and make sure that they're following all of the new requisites, because I'm just concerned that folks will get kind of sideswiped by these new pesticide label changes. They are the biggest changes that we've undergone with pesticide labels since the worker protection standards. And those were kind of a heavy lift at the time too. So, and thank you, Josie. I see you put some of that in the chat. So appreciate that. Now we get into some of the fun stuff for sprayer optimization and some of the stuff that I really enjoy talking about. So water quality. Water quality is probably, to me, the most important part of your pesticide tank mix. So if you think about it, probably 95% of your tank mix is simply water. And the quality of the water can have huge impacts on both your sprayer, like the physical sprayer and its ability to perform its job, and the pesticide active ingredients and the chemistries involved. So there's a whole range of issues that can come up depending on your water. You can end up with debris that can clog your nozzles. Your turbidity can neutralize some of your active ingredients. Your pH can affect the efficacious period of the pesticides and their chemical stability. And you can have dissolved solids having a similar effect as pH. So I know where I'm at. We have folks that use water from a lot of different sources. Okay, so we have folks that use surface water, especially if they have processor bound commodities, so grapes in the juice belt. We have folks using surface water, like ponds. We have folks using well water, municipal water, and then in some cases we have folks that have permits to draw water from surface water public sources, like in the Finger Lakes, Seneca Lake. You're allowed to draw water for agricultural purposes from the lake itself. So there's a big range of what can happen depending on the source of your water. And water from a single source can change drastically over a single growing season. And that's really important to remember. So this was an example of from a presentation that I gave in the Finger Lakes. And we had access, the grower here had access to 4 different water sources. They had a rainwater catchment system, they had a pond, they had access to Seneca Lake, and they had municipal water. So they were really lucky in their case because they had a lot of different options for their operation. And so we did kind of a thought experiment with this, and we took one of these pool test strips. These are just swimming pool test strips. We got them off Amazon. And these are great for just a quick and dirty assessment of your water, right? And so we dipped the stick in all the four different waters, and then we looked at them and we decided which one we were going to use for a spray program and why, or which one we wouldn't use and why. And in this case, one of the first things that jumps out at me is the pH. So the pH from Seneca Lake and the municipal water supply was close to 9. And, these colorimetric strips, they're not perfect. There's a lot of different options that you can use for testing water quality. I like these because they give you kind of a roundabout for a lot of different metrics. But you can use a simple digital pH meter. Litmus paper works in a pinch. And really, it's super critical to check your water before every spray application. And I know that sounds like a really heavy lift. And I know a lot of folks do have practices to, add something like AMS at the beginning of their tank mix in order to overcome any high pH issues if you know you have one. But at the same time, this can change. This really can fluctuate. Municipal water does tend to run high in pH consistently because having a higher pH means less lead can potentially leach into drinking water. So that's, municipal water is always going to be sort of high. But what I've seen in years, and I'm not sure if the Midwest was hit as hard as Pennsylvania and Western New York, but we had some drought conditions and we saw the pH go up in a lot of our water sources, including private wells and surface water ponds. So that can change throughout a season. Rainwater is usually going to have a lower pH. It's generally pretty neutral as far as it goes. But you still want to check before every application, because even if you're storing water in a cistern or something, that pH can change over time. So you really want to make sure you're testing your water before every application. And this chart right here is a great demonstration of why pH is one of the really important pieces. We can see, and keep in mind, this is half-life of pesticides, not necessarily their efficacious period. For carbol is one of those common examples that you see. And I would say that where it says at a half-life at a pH of 6, it has 125 days half-life. I would say that probably works out to about a week to 7 days of efficacious period, given the weather conditions, at a pH of 6. Whereas at a pH of 9, where the half-life is only 1 day, I mean, that's hours. That means that your product is only going to be efficacious once it's applied for a few hours versus a week. So that to me is just, that alone is a really big reason why we really need to be checking pH as frequently as is reasonable, and really paying attention to our water as it's coming into the tank, and making sure that we're making any changes to that before we add our active ingredients. So the number one thing that I would suggest for spray optimization really is check the pH of your water and make any adjustments before you put your active ingredients in, unless there's a specific mixing order on the label that you're required to follow. So something that has come up quite a bit in conversations with growers and at quite a few of our meetings is, I'm not sure about practices in the Midwest necessarily, but a lot of folks add fertilizer to their spray program in order to help work as a buffer for that pH issue with the water. And also because a lot of the fertilizers have a slight burn down activity on some of our common fungal diseases. So people will add a product in, and on the fertilizer bag and in general mixing order, the fertilizer is added last, right? That's usually what the recommendation is for a fertilizer. However, if you are using the fertilizer as your tank conditioner or to buffer a pH issue, you want to make sure to add it first, because then you can adjust down the pH of your water. You can safely test it and make sure you've lowered the pH to what the optimum performance level is for your active ingredients before you've created a hot mix that you don't want to, stick stuff into and contaminate things with. So you want to make sure that your pH and that your water is good quality before you're adding your actives. Some of the other things that I mentioned earlier, if you have algae, if you have turbidity in your water, so the two big culprits of breakthroughs in chemistries in terms of contaminated water. If you have algae, even if it's just the tiniest bit of green, and this is really, really going to impact your herbicides, is if you have what's essentially single cell plant material in your tank, and then you put in an active herbicide, the herbicide activity is going to be used up on the algae before it leaves the tank. So you want to make sure that you're not neutralizing or giving the pesticide something to work on before it leaves the tank. Same goes with clay. So very, very fine soil particles are very very charged molecules. They have a high cation exchange capacity. And that means that they have the ability to bind very strongly with those pesticide active ingredients. And they can essentially neutralize that active ingredient chemically before they leave your tank. And so that can be a really big issue. And then finally, one of our larger issues, is going to be debris. So I do see folks, and maybe if you're not using a lot of surface water because of FSMA and some of those other requirements, then this doesn't really apply to you. But if you are using surface water, or if you have a well with a lot of sediment, which I do see sometimes too, those little bits of debris that can get into your spray tank can wreak all kinds of havoc in your program. So this is a multi-row sprayer, and I know those aren't very common in tree fruit. We use them in grapes. I see them occasionally in high density plantings for apples, but not that often. But even small pieces of debris can block your nozzles and cause major issues. So if you have ceramic disc nozzles, your standard air induction nozzles, any of those, these little tiny bits of debris or sediment can block the nozzle. And if you think about a spray array, so maybe you have 20 nozzles, 10 on each side of an air blast, you can have one nozzle where your orifice is cracked and it's basically like a pencil stream coming out of that nozzle. And you could have 3 that are completely clogged or blocked. And you're going to be putting out the same amount of material, but it's not going out in a consistent manner. And so that's one of those big issues with the debris. And the easiest, fastest way to get past that is just to use a simple sediment filter before the water goes into your spray tank. Again, water is the largest component of your tank mix. So you want to make sure, for the best optimization of your equipment, you want to make sure that the water going in is the best quality that you can manage. So a simple sediment filter, testing the pH before the water goes into the spray tank, and making sure that water is high quality as possible is the best way to get the most out of your active ingredients. Now, that being said, I know it's not always possible to find an alternative water source if you notice an issue with yours. So what are some other things that we can do? Well, like I said, a sediment filter. There's some adjuvants that can overcome, or tank conditioners that can overcome some of these issues with pH. So make sure that you're making those adjustments ahead of time. And finally, if you know that you have water quality issues, but you need your pesticide to work, consider using the highest allowed application rate. If you know you're going to lose some of that active ingredient to the water quality itself, you want to use the higher label rate in order to overcome some of that. And you also want to get out and spray as quickly as possible. So the more time that those active ingredients have to interact with the water and have those chemical reactions, the more active ingredient you're going to lose. So you want to make sure that you're getting out and spraying the tank mix as quickly as possible so that there's not much time for those reactions to take place before the active ingredient is where you want it to be. Um, so yeah, so there can be a lot of issues associated with water quality. And those are some of the things that you have the most control over in most cases. Obviously, if you're, really rural, you only have a well, that's your only water source, you're going to have to work with what you have. But making sure that you're doing everything possible to mitigate those issues ahead of time is really important. So with that being said, um, I want to talk a little bit about nozzle issues because we started talking about them before. And this is an example of a calibration that I did out in the field. And on the left, you have what I do. So for folks that aren't familiar or haven't seen like a formal collection calibration before, each of these tubes, each of these graduated cylinders has a very long tube and a clamp. And I hook a clamp up to each one of the nozzles on the array. And we turn the machine on like we would if we were spraying. It's really important when you're doing these calibrations to have the nozzles open the same way that you would if you were spraying. So you hook up all of the collection tubes and then you get out of the way because there's always a little bit of overspray, and you open up the sprayer and you collect for a set amount of time. And we can through this collection, we can figure out how many gallons per acre we're actually applying. We can check to make sure that the flow rate, if you have a flow rate sensor, we can make sure that that's accurate. I do want to point out that if you have a machine, if you have a sprayer that has a controller on it and has a flow rate sensor, those need to be ground proofed. And that's something that we don't think about a lot. So there's three pieces to our spray program that need to be ground proofed from time to time. So this is one of those critical pieces for sprayer optimization. So those are going to be the speedometer of our tractor, our pressure gauge for our sprayer, and our flow rate sensor if we have one. So if you have a speed and pressure based system, obviously all of these things are very important. But even if you have a controller, sometimes those can fall out of whack too. Now, if you think about it, Weights and Measures comes and checks your digital scales all the time, every year, right? Because our digital scales can fall out of calibration. So can all of these pieces of our spray equipment. And yeah, pressure gauges go out all the time. The only way to test them is against a working one, which I think is really funny. We know speedometers on tractors can be really inaccurate. If you have a GPS system, then that is going to be much more accurate and probably doesn't need proofed in the same way. But if you have a standard speedometer, you absolutely need to do a time test occasionally to make sure that that's accurate. And you need to calculate out to make sure that you're putting on the correct gallons per acre. And so that's the first step in the calibration, right? First, you need to make sure that you're putting out the right gallons per acre. Now, this on the left for this collection, the flow rate and the numbers that I calculated out for how much was leaving the machine, the flow rate sensor was accurate in this case. But as you can see on the right, that was what the desired spray output was. That's where they wanted the spray to go. So in this case, let me see, I don't know if I have the picture. Nope, I don't have the picture of it set up. So this was two sides of a sprayer. So they had 5 nozzles open on each side. So the lowest two, which are the outermost tubes, those were the bottom nozzles on one side of the sprayer. And where it says highest in the middle, those were the top 2 nozzles on the sprayer. And then the 3 in the middle, this was for grapes. So the 3 in the middle were for canopy, right? So these were the 2 sides of the sprayer, and you wanted the most coming out in the canopy. So on the right is after the calibration, and on the left is beforehand. And as you can see, they were not getting the coverage that they wanted. They were having some material breakthrough issues. And we also noticed that there's an issue with material settling. If you could see on those lowest most nozzles, there was material settling, and those nozzles were actually starting to wear out also because of extra corrosion, because of this material that was settling out through the frame. So in order to optimize your sprayer, you really need to know what's coming out of each nozzle. Because on the left, the flow rate sensor said they were putting out X number of gallons per acre. We ground proofed it. Yes, they were putting out that many gallons per acre, but it wasn't going out in the pattern that was desired by the grower for maximum efficiency. And so after the calibration, we were able to, clean some nozzles, replace some broken pieces, check some filters, and we were able to get the machine into calibration. But had we not taken the time to do that ground proofing, they wouldn't have known, and they would have continued to have material failures, because it just really wasn't giving them the coverage that they wanted in some parts of their canopy. So this is one of the most important pieces. It's also on the pesticide labels, to use a properly calibrated machine. And the only way to properly calibrate a machine is to do this ground proofing. So that's probably one of to me, this is the second most important piece of spray optimization, is making sure that you have a properly calibrated machine, not only in the sense that it's putting out the gallons per acre that you anticipate, because that's obviously very important for your dilution rates and your label requirements, but also to make sure that you know that the right amount of material is leaving the machine in the spray pattern that you desire. And so that can be a challenge. And, I have these fancy frames, but you can do this with any simple collection tool. One of my colleagues has used milkers, so like from that they use on cows from dairies. Sorry, I'm not a dairy person, but I just know these things exist from pesticide sprayer calibrations. But you can take a piece of flexible rubber tubing, hook it up to a milker, and you can pop that over each of your nozzles, and then have the tubes go out into a bucket and collect it into a bucket. And then you may not have 10 fancy graduated cylinders. All you really need is one measuring device, and then you pour out the material from the bucket into your measuring container and write down what each of them was putting out and see if that matches what your nozzle specifications were. And you're going to find that in those nozzle charts. Any of your agricultural supply folks should have one of those nozzle selection charts that can help you figure out, okay, at the pressure that I'm spraying and at the rate that I want to apply and the droplet size that I desire, what's going to be the best nozzle for this selection. And we do find that your nozzles can last a couple of seasons under optimum conditions. If you're using a lot of abrasive products, like copper and sulfur, or surround, like bentonite, can be really abrasive. If you're using a lot of those products, you might want to replace your nozzles a little bit more frequently, but usually replacing all of your nozzles every couple of years, and then performing your sprayer calibration yearly just to make sure everything's where you expect it to be, can be a great way to check in with everything and see what's going on. So one of the other issues that I do see from time to time, that's hard to catch without doing one of these collection calibrations, is that you'll see that, for instance, one side of your machine will be putting out more material than the other side of your machine. And that can be pump issues and filter issues and a lot of different things. But what that can mean is, if you're doing, especially if you're not doing an every row spray program, if you're doing every other row, you may be seriously underspraying on the lower side or overspraying on the other. So really doing this collection-based calibration is one of your best bets. I recommend doing it yearly, but even if you haven't done it in a while, or if you haven't ever done it with your sprayer, just checking in and seeing where everything's at can be really, really beneficial. So just to kind of circle back here for some of our water quality issues, like I said, You want to make sure that you're using good quality filtered water. You want to make sure that you're following your label very explicitly. Sometimes the labels have a lot of information buried down on page like 9 or 15 on ways to improve the pesticide efficacy. So the label is going to be your best friend if you know you're having material issues. Sometimes there will be clauses for if you have hard water, make these adjustments. I've seen some products now that say don't use AMS as your conditioner for these reasons. They can also let you know if there's issues with incompatibilities. I've done a few workshops teaching people how to recognize uh, tank mixing incompatibilities, because I feel like that's something that those reactions can actually happen so quickly and be so subtle that you may not catch them if you're not really paying attention, especially if it's not something that's really, really obvious. So make sure you're doing your jar tests when you're getting ready to do a tank mix that you haven't used in the past, because sometimes just a small amount of effervescence can indicate a neutralizing reaction. Sometimes you'll get a crystallizing reaction where if you mix two products together and they change color suddenly, that can actually mean that you've deactivated your active ingredient by creating a new salt. And that can cause your product to precipitate out. But again, it doesn't look like much. It's just a very subtle color change. Usually you'll add two relatively clear products and they suddenly become opaque. While it doesn't cause any major issues, it can mean that your products aren't going to work as well as they should have or at all. So sometimes those really subtle chemical changes are something you need to pay attention to as well. And the only way you can do that is with a jar test, which is a whole other presentation. But just a friendly reminder that that's also something recommended on most pesticide labels, is to make sure that you're checking your pesticide compatibilities and paying attention for very subtle reactions in order to make sure that you're not neutralizing your active ingredients prior to application. Make sure that you're following your proper mixing order as determined by the label. I've spent some time researching in the last year to see what the best practices are for mixing order in these day and age. And really, it's all over the place. There are so many products out there, so many formulations, so many adjuvants. The best place to look for the proper mixing order is going to be on your pesticide label or on the chemical supplier website. They frequently have recommendations for mixing order that oftentimes are contradictory to what we've traditionally been taught if we learned one of the acronyms like whales or something. So check your pesticide label, check your pesticide label, check your pesticide label. If you haven't read the label thoroughly in a couple of years, if you've just been, just following what you've always done with that product because you're familiar with it, take the time to reread the label for new updates. Again, a lot of them will have information for overcoming water quality issues. They will have tank mixing recommendations or tank mixing partners. They will have extra information on avoiding runoff, such as giving you the correct droplet size for your nozzles. Make sure that your nozzles are in good working order. And then, of course, calibrate your sprayer. Replace your nozzles, screens, and filters often if you haven't taken the time to check your owner's manual. Some colleagues and I have been talking about doing some trainings around, how to find the hard to find filters. Make sure that you check the screens on your nozzles and replace those very often, probably more often the screens or the filters before the nozzle. Make sure you're replacing them often. If you're using air induction nozzles, and I don't have one here because I would show the demonstration really quick, but for anybody that hasn't seen it, if you loop a piece of wire through the tip of the air induction nozzles, they actually pop apart into two pieces. And you can get sediment and debris or just goop from your pesticides inside of those air induction nozzles. So make sure you're popping them all the way open and cleaning them thoroughly a few times per season for optimization. Make sure you're familiar with all the pieces and parts of your nozzles and that you have the correct ones selected for your application. Make sure that you are make sure you're testing the pH of your water before every application, which I know it sounds like a heavy lift, but if you get one of those little digital devices that are under $100 now, or a bottle of those test strips, just a quick check to make sure everything is where you think it is. It just takes a few moments, and it's so much better to take those few moments to do these practices than it is to, spray hundreds or thousands of dollars worth of product only for it to not do what it was supposed to do. There's nothing more devastating from what I've seen in my work than realizing that you had a material breakthrough. And the process of backtracking to figure out what went wrong is exhaustive, and it's really challenging if you already are dealing with loss of a crop or loss of crop value to then go back and try to figure out what went wrong. There's a lot of things you can do preventatively to make sure that you're getting the most out of your spray materials and checking your water quality, making sure that your pH is correct, making sure that your pesticides are all compatible, making sure that your sprayer is clean and calibrated. All of these things mean that should you have a material breakthrough, it's much easier to point or to look to other issues that may have happened, because we have, ongoing issues with resistance and pests. We have issues with weather and timing. We have all of these things that we're up against. So making sure that you've done your work to make sure that everything going into your tank and in your tank and the tank itself are all optimized for the best success for your program is going to make it that much easier if you do have a breakthrough to figure out what went wrong. So that's just I do these multi-row sprayers, and a lot of times folks don't understand what I'm talking about when I'm hooking up the calibration. I should have put this slide earlier, but you can see here there's the collection tubes and those clamps that hook up to those tubes. So that's how my collection equipment works. But like I said, a milker, a tube, and a bucket works just fine. Okay, so I didn't quite go to the hour, but I'm happy to open up the conversation. I'll leave my contact information up here for a minute, just in case anybody wants to reach out to me about calibration program or best practices or water quality, any of those things. I'm always happy to talk about and happy to get away from my computer work for a minute. So happy to take calls about any of those things. And yeah, I don't know if we have any questions come in, but I'm happy to answer anything now.
Yeah, so we just had again, just a reminder, throw your questions in the little Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. It has a little question mark with a box around it. We do have one question in here. So the question is, do you have any experience with spray drones? If so, I'm wondering what you've seen in terms of effectiveness or have a point of view on them versus air blast sprayers.
That is a fantastic question.
That's a
So
good question.
I personally so I have not had the opportunity to do any research myself with drones. However, my colleague, Mike Reinke, who is at Michigan State, has been doing work with drones in specialty crops for, gosh, I don't know if you're familiar with Mike's work, Josie, but he's was that a nod? um, he's
Yeah.
been working, yeah, so I don't know, 10 years maybe now. Um, he has actually managed to achieve excellent disease management in full canopy Concord grapes. So on a personal level, if you can get a sprayer to penetrate into a Concord grape canopy and manage the pest and disease issues in there, then that is an effective spray program. So Mike has done some fantastic work and has some fantastic presentations. And I know that they are planning a big drone tech day in Michigan in September. I don't have the exact dates because it's kind of in save the date land right now. And I know it's a bit of a haul where we're at, but at the Cornell facility that I work at, so the Cornell Lake Erie Research and Extension Laboratory, we're doing a sprayer technology day, and we'll have some drone demonstrations there. And we're hoping to actually have cooperative weather so we can do some side-by-side water sensitive paper coverage demonstrations in full canopy Concord with some standard issue type sprayers with controller systems, as well as with some high tech robotics. So I guess the short answer there is that yes, we have seen excellent disease and pest management in full canopy grapes and apples with drones, but it is very new technology. And I know we had a conference here in New York in March, and some of the drone folks that have been working primarily in agronomy are now starting to look into branching out into specialty crops based on some of that research. So I think that it is definitely something coming down the pipeline. I will say that one of the issues with drones is that as far as the ROI, they're not, depending on what land you're in as far as the expensive sprayers. I know folks out here that have purchased multi-row, huge Gregoire sprayers that are close to $500,000. So if you're in that territory, drones are really cheap. If you're more of the like $50,000 maybe something you can swing, then that's kind of where drones are at. They're probably around $50,000-$60,000 for a full setup to do, a decent size acreage. And they only last a few years. So that's the biggest issue with drones, is that really all of the components wear very quickly. So you're looking at having to refurbish that entire system. It's a pretty high turnover. And this is just kind of off the cuff, I foresee it being more of a service to the industry rather than something I see a lot of growers moving into as their primary spray mechanism. That being said, it could make a lot of sense for an operation where they don't spray as frequently, or they don't have as many employees, or if they have a lot of like inclement weather issues or wet areas where it makes it hard for the tractor and sprayer to get in. So there's a lot to consider, but I think the biggest thing to keep in mind with drones is that you do end up having to replace almost the entire system probably every 3 years or so, 7 at the most. And at that point, you've replaced almost every component in the system anyway. So that's something to consider. But we are getting good coverage. It is a viable technology for specialty crops that we're looking forward to. And I foresee it, being kind of a service industry like they do in agronomy, at least to start out with, until maybe they're a little bit more affordable.
Yeah, I got to dabble a little bit in drone spray technology and potatoes for
Okay.
in my grad work, and it was really interesting. But I will also second, we went from the really small ones where we kind of jerry rigged them, and then we have these big, like almost 8 foot wide drones
They're
that,
almost the size of like a Mini Cooper. Like they
yeah,
they are hefty. And so yeah, so if your operation is right next to your spray barn and you can mix right there and everything, that's great. And then it could be a really good option. But if you are having to move it from place to place and be able to hot mix
yeah,
to load the drone, you also are looking at the investment of a trailer that can go with the drone with clean water and a hot tank, and the ability to refill the drone for it to go, because they can only hold about 50 gallons for
yeah,
the
50
for the bigger
gallons.
ones. I think some of the newer ones are pushing up to 100 now, but just the same, that's a heavy load, and they're still having to come back and refill pretty often. So you do have to have that mixing station set up. And if you're a ways from your primary loading area, that can be a challenge too with the drones.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely
it's more
some
the
tweaks.
logistics.
Yeah, some tweaks to logistics would be awesome. I think it would make it a lot more accessible, and a
Mhm.
little bit easier to use. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing kind of some of the innovations there for sure.
Yeah,
It'll
and
be
I mean,
fun.
I don't know what it looks like in the Midwest, but you know, I know as out in our region, there's been, you know, labor shortages, I think is just kind of a thing in agriculture, especially specialty crops that are really hands-on. So I think as, you know, we're dealing with some of these labor issues, you know, maybe
Yeah.
successorship issues on farms that, you know, maybe spraying as a service is kind of making a comeback. And that's, you
Mhm.
know, something to think about. You know, maybe that makes sense for your operation. And this could be a good opportunity for some new innovation in business as well. And it is exciting to see that they are getting as good of coverage. Some of it comes down to the way that they spray. So with that downward movement, especially in the grape canopies, apples, you know, they have a little bit more open space. So you don't get the shingling like we do in grapes, where when you apply a jet of air, like an air blast sprayer, all the leaves just flatten like shingles on a
Yeah.
roof, and the material can just roll off and you don't get that penetration in the canopy. It takes a lot of that's a whole other optimization piece that I didn't really get into today because there's so many different types of sprayers. It's hard to just say, oh, here's the settings that you need, but you got to make sure that your pressure and um, your air velocity isn't actually
Mhm.
making things worse.
Right.
But
Right.
again, without a sprayer in front of me or something to work with, it's hard to really get into the weeds on that. But the drones actually, the way they move the air gets really good penetration into the canopy and overcome some of those issues that we see with air blast sprayers from the ground, which is cool.
Right. It's really cool. Very interesting stuff.
Mhm.
Um, if anyone has any questions, again, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. We're just a couple minutes away here. Just a reminder, I will send out all of these resources that I threw in the chat in an email, as well as including an evaluation link. Um, but we'll wait maybe just like a minute or so here and see if anyone throws a question in. Otherwise, we don't have any more questions. We'll probably just end a little early. Any others? Last time there was like one like last minute question. So
Yeah, I'm happy to hang out for just a second anyway.
cool.
See, we don't have the nice weather. We just had a freeze event 2 days
Uh,
ago, and it's raining right now. And I don't think anyone really wants to talk to me because everyone's out just assessing the damage at this moment. You know, we're a few days out, and this is our first like infection period
uh,
post. Like, I think we got down to 22,
oh wow,
and
that's
yeah,
a yeah.
yep. And now we have an
Yeah.
infection period, so we're like,
Oh
it's
wow.
kind of insult to injury right now, and
Yeah, we're hitting 80 next week. So gonna
any
be an
rain in the
interesting time. Oh
forecast.
yeah, lots of rain. We've had lots of rain. Yeah. We need it so bad, but not the best timing in the springtime when things are just waking up.
Over bloom. I know it's always
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so stressful.
Yeah. All right. Well, doesn't appear we have any more questions coming in. So I think we'll go ahead and call it. And yeah, I'll follow up with everyone who joined next week. And just want to say a big thank you to Megan for joining us. This was really great information. I think I learned a lot. Hope you all did too. Awesome. See ya. Take care.